In this session, we'll discuss forecasting and replenishment concepts. Effective inventory management basically means getting the right amount of inventory to the right place at the right time to satisfy your customers without carrying too much inventory and incurring too much cost. So let's talk a little bit about results first, and then what's involved in actually achieving effective inventory management. What are the steps that we go through to make this possible? So in the results area, the first example is actually reducing inventory. So let's say a company with $20 million in inventory reduces that inventory by 20%, and that's quite conservative. The 20% reduction sometimes becomes 30-35% in a lot of companies, depending on how well you've managed your inventory to date. But if you reduce it by this conservative 20%, you reduce $4 million in inventory. $4 million times 20% carrying cost results in $800,000 to the bottom line. That's quite dramatic with a small investment in the forecasting replenishment principles to start with. Some byproducts to this is actually reducing stock outages, because what we're trying to do is to have the right inventory and not too much of the wrong inventory. So increased sales as a result of actually having that inventory and increased customer satisfaction is a dramatic byproduct as well. And then often overlooked, lower transportation costs. Vendor to warehouse, warehouse to warehouse, and warehouse to customer. So if you have the inventory at the right place, you move it less. If you buy inventory from the vendor in the correct quantities, you're going to reduce your transportation costs, reduce expediting costs, and those kinds of things. So results are quite dramatic in this area of the ERP concept. So let's talk a minute about what's involved in effective inventory management. And I know most of you would probably agree that an accurate forecast is really important. And all too often, I think we place too much emphasis on the accuracy of the forecast, and that is extremely important. But the forecast itself is about 50% of what you need to really do to achieve effective inventory management. If you have a 100% accurate forecast, you process it without dynamic controls and without a lot of concepts that we're going to be talking about, you still probably make the wrong decision quite often, costing you money and costing you customer service. So let's talk again about the accuracy of the forecast. So historical usage is where the statistical forecast or history-based forecast starts. And we want filtered usage. We want to make sure that we have historical usage that represents, at least in some fashion, what will happen again in the future. If it's a seasonal item or a seasonal group of items, we want to know that when the season starts and ends and those kinds of things. Historical usage tells us that. And then collaborative input from customers is very important. If you have large customers that buy large amounts of product from you, it's important to collaborate with that customer just to have a discussion with them about what they foresee in the future on certain products, product lines, and those kinds of things. We have a subsystem for customer collaborative forecasting, which we will review in one of the videos, but basically what we're actually trying to accomplish here is collaborating with a customer and finding out what he knows that our system and our database doesn't know at this point. And then sporadic items. If you're a hard goods distributor, I would say that there's probably sometimes 30, 40, 50% of your items that you sell sporadically, and you can't really forecast it. So a lot of companies in the forecasting area define the items that they can forecast and ignore the others. And they tell you to set min-max quantities and things of that sort on those items. What we try and do is to look at those sporadic items and set a target stock level for you to stock in order to carry that item. Now, we might suggest that you not carry the item, but you might know that you have to do that to be in business. You might know that that item contributes to the sales of another item and things of that sort. So sporadic items are extremely important and often overlooked. Then, as I said before, the forecast is about 50% of the problem. The other problem is replenishment. How are we going to replenish? You know, lead time management. It's amazing, and I think you would agree probably if you're listening to this video, that your lead time from a vendor fluctuates quite often, and quite often you don't have management managing capabilities in your system to look at what the lead time is on a given item. Many of your vendors may have items that you can get in 10 days and other items you can get in 90 days. Sometimes there's a knee-jerk reaction in this industry of saying, well, the lead time here is 90 days or 45 days, somewhere in the middle. So what we want to do is we want to manage that. We want to know how long we think it will take to get an item when we order it from a given vendor to a given warehouse based on history. And we want to analyze that over time to see if it's going up and down and things of that sort. Dynamic buying controls. We're going to talk about something called lead time horizon. We're going to talk about DRP, distribution requirements planning, and things of that sort in some of these videos. And so what we're going to be talking about there is that if you have this accurate forecast and you deal with static controls, you know, stocking levels, fixed stocking levels, and things of that sort, then what you end up with is making a bad decision. Vendor minimums. A great situation where you have an opportunity to buy a truckload or fill a container if you're importing, or maybe you have a small vendor and you have to reach a certain target dollar-wise or unit-wise. So looking at vendor targets based on as compared to what you really need in your company today from that particular vendor will allow you to either reach those targets, delay your purchase, or push the lead time days, or push the amount of days that you're going to buy to reach that target if you decide to do that. And then containerization, very important, certainly if you import. You really want to make sure that you're buying at the container level. And so you need to know how much inventory you have to buy to fill that container, or those kind of things, or do you consolidate vendors into a single container, that type of thing. So containerization is extremely important for the buyer at the point in time that they're actually placing the purchase order. Where to stock items. What you really need to do is to actually have a forecast at every level of your operation and know what a given warehouse is expected to sell, or you expect that they will sell, and then what warehouse supplies them, or maybe you supply from a vendor, those kind of things. So that where to stock items is extremely important. So we need a forecast, and a reasonably accurate forecast at all levels, not just at the top level where you buy from the vendor. And then hub and spoke. And you might say hub and spoke doesn't work for us because XYZ. And one of the things that would cause hub and spoke not to work is if your transportation costs are extremely high as compared to the cost of the product. And so you don't want to move it around. Maybe it's heavy, bulky material, those kinds of things. But hub and spoke quite often can be used, even in that scenario, for sporadic items and that type of scenario. So what we're really trying to do here is to say, you have a hierarchy where you can't buy enough at a given level or a given warehouse to supply the vendor's minimums, so let's buy at another warehouse and then ship part of that product to other warehouses. And I'm going to go into that in a little bit later in another session where we'll talk about branch replenishment and hub and spoke and what the benefits of that might be. And then production and kitting. Now, if it were 10, 15 years ago when we were doing this presentation, and you were a distributor, you would probably say, "Don't talk to me about production." Today, I'll bet that all of you who are listening to this do some type of production. You do some kind of packaging, repackaging, sending product out, having it changed, bringing it in. So we see this a lot today in the distribution world, and also kitting. And kitting has been around a long time. That's where you would actually assemble product at the time that you're actually filling the order. And maybe there's not an assembly process, maybe it's just a pick process. But what we want to do here is we want to forecast at the production or at the finished good level of finished good production, either a bagged product or packaged product or whatever, or at the kit level. And then we want to drive component demand, and we'll talk about this in other sessions as well. We'll drive that component demand into replenishment in a time phase manner so that we make sure that we have the components that we need to fill that. So let's talk a little bit about creating an accurate forecast first. So filtering historical usage is extremely important. You want to exclude one-time sales. You want to make sure that if you get a large customer and that first level of stocking for that customer is huge, you really need to make sure that you don't assume that that's going to happen again next week or next month. So you need to exclude at least some of those quantities from the historical usage. And there's a whole adjustment process that we'll talk about in some of the videos as well, where we can automatically do that or actually have you affect that as well. So again, excluding one-time sales. Consider excluding drop shipments from the vendor to the customer. Okay, you're drop shipping a product, so what we want to do is to say, are we going to consider this historical usage? If I wanted to have that in inventory, if I should have had it in stock, I didn't, I had to drop ship it from the vendor in order to get it to the customer on time, then that should be historical usage from my warehouse. If I chose to drop ship that because of quantity or something of that sort, I don't want to plan to have that in the warehouse, so I don't want to include that in historical usage. That doesn't mean the numbers aren't there, that doesn't mean the buyer can't see those, but in terms of what the forecast uses as historical usage to create the future forecast, it would be excluded from that. And then one of the things also is unusual usage and smoothing usage. So we have algorithms in the system that would smooth historical usage. We like to start with about 2 years worth of history. And if we bring that in from your old system and we're not, and it's not smooth historical usage, and you haven't actually reviewed it and things of that sort, then we'll apply algorithms to that to try and slice off the peaks and put it in the valleys, if you will, to get consistent usage. Because the more consistent your historical usage is, the more accurate your forecast will be. And then you probably are familiar with this concept, best fit formula, or best fit formula approach, or best fit formula assignment. And basically what that means is that you reforecast the past for every item in every warehouse every time you create a forecast and compare it to all of the formulas and what it would have forecast. Compare that in terms of accuracy and choose the formula that best performed in the past and use it for the future. Okay, so basically the system is saying this is the best formula for this item. Now, we deliver 18 formulas with the system. You can actually add, change, and delete formulas, and we'll talk about that in other videos as well. But basically, what we're trying to do there is to say, let the system make that decision for you, because it can crunch a lot of data today. And we're trying to let the system decide what formula it will best perform in the future. And then items that can't be forecast, and basically we discussed that a minute ago relative to sporadic and seasonal items and some of those kinds of things. Seasonal items are actually quite easy to forecast, assuming seasons are kind of start and end at the same time. Even multiple seasons in a year is easy to forecast. But those sporadic items, and telling the difference between a sporadic item and a seasonal item is difficult sometimes. So we have an analysis of looking to see, well, we have kind of lumps in our historical usage here. Does that represent seasonality, and did it happen in 2 years in a row in the roughly the same time? If so, yes, it's probably seasonal. Yes, we'll forecast it based on seasonal, and we'll look at the growth of your business this year, this year versus last year, and things of that sort. And then if you measure forecast accuracy, and it's an important thing to do, what you should do, in our opinion, is to forecast, or is to measure your forecast accuracy across all items. It doesn't really do you any good to look at the top 10% of your items and say that forecast accuracy is wonderful. The other 90% I'm dying on, but that 10% is very accurate. So forecast accuracy across all your items, at least the items that you can forecast. How well did it work? What do we need to do to fine-tune that? And that's very important in terms of getting an accurate forecast. And then if we talk about replenishment, one of the things that is extremely important, in my opinion, is visibility. If I tell a buyer to buy 500 units or 200 units of a product, and the buyer looks at that number and says, I'm not sure if that's right, we really need to be able to click the mouse a couple of times, drill down and look at how those numbers were created, and then the buyer can either agree or disagree. And I'm a huge proponent of this is a tool. It's not the end all. It is a tool that the buyer uses, and the buyer can override the system if they know something that the system couldn't know, or he knows something that's coming up that the system couldn't know. So basically what we're trying to say there is, when we make a calculation, we show you how we made that calculations, the input into the calculations, and the result, so you can agree or disagree, make adjustments as necessary. And then dynamic controls. I can't overstate dynamic controls. A lot of companies will set a stocking level, or even in a fixed min-max or a fixed stocking level, and then not review that for 6 months or 9 months or 12 months. And what happens then is you start selling more of a product or less of a product. You're all out of whack with what reality is. And so what we really want to do there is to make sure that we are looking at dynamic controls. Now, along with dynamic controls is time phase expected inventory. And what you really need to know as they happen, as sales orders come in, shipments come in, expected receipt dates change, every transaction in an ERP system has an expected date. As that changes, dynamically it should affect what you're buying, what your replenishment model will be for today, and what you will transfer to another location, what you'll buy from a vendor, all those kinds of things. So it's extremely important for that time phase expected inventory to be there, and also be real time, or as close to real time as possible. And then the replenishment path. You should be able to set a given item and say, when I buy this item, where do I get my inventory? From any of your warehouses. So you might say warehouse 1 is buying from the vendor, and then another warehouse, when he needs his inventory, is buying from warehouse 1. And we'll talk about this, and that's more of a hub and spoke approach. Again, doesn't work for all items, doesn't work for all businesses, but I would say about 70 or 75% of our customers that use at least some hub and spoke capability, and it really saves them a lot of time and effort, and also a lot of money in terms of potentially overstocking warehouses. Vendor lead times, we've discussed this before. We actually analyze vendor lead times coming in, and we want to make sure that we can look at the historical pattern and say we know with reasonable certainty when we'll get this product if we order it. That dramatically changes how much you order when you order. If your lead time is thought to be 90 days, you're going to actually have to commit or order for inventory that gets through that 90-day time frame, plus some safety stock and say review cycle. So what we're trying to do here is to manage that lead time so that we actually buy the right amount of product and not overstock or understock. And then lead time horizon, and we're going to go into this in a lot of detail in other videos, but basically What we're talking about for a lead time horizon is today plus lead time, review cycle, and safety stock. Now we all know what lead time is. That's the date, the time it takes from when you place the order to you receive the goods. The review cycle is how often you place a purchase order. So if I place a purchase order once a week, that review cycle is 7 days. If I place a purchase order once a month, that review cycle is 30 days. I have to buy for the lead time plus this review cycle because it's potentially going to be another 30 days maybe before I place a purchase order to the vendor. So we have to take that in consideration. And then of course safety stock. So if we represent those all in days, then if we are reviewing the vendor today, so we start today and we go through lead time, so let's say we have 60 days, review cycle is 7, that's 67 days, and then a safety stock, whatever that number of days is, and that's how much inventory you need to have on order at least for that particular item and that particular vendor. And that's a dynamic control. So as that lead time changes, as review cycles change, safety stock changes, that's dynamic. As the forecast goes up, the forecast goes down, all those kinds of things. And it really is an extremely dynamic concept of using all of these controls here. Again, vendor targets, net weight, gross weight, dollars, and volume would be your targets probably, and sometimes units. And so we actually, when we create a suggested order, we'll show you what those targets are and then what the system says that you need. And then you can make a determination. Do I increase what I'm going to buy on some of the items, or what I like best is to say, I want to buy another 5 days, 7 days worth of inventory to reach that target and have it actually adjust the suggested order for me. So those are some of the concepts in the replenishment side. Now let's assume that we do a fairly accurate job of forecasting and a fairly accurate job of replenishment. So we shouldn't have huge inventory levels. But let's think about it. If you have huge inventory levels today and you start using the system, that excess and surplus inventory doesn't necessarily just automatically go away. In fact, you'll be buying the products that you need, increasing those levels, and if you don't get rid of the products or somehow sell some of the products that you don't need, then your inventory will actually increase instead of decrease. And so we have to manage that whole reduction of inventory. I have some dramatic stories about that. Have a customer that had $80 million in inventory and in 6 months reduced it by $20 million. And 2/3 of that inventory that he reduced, he actually sold along with other products with special scenarios and things of that sort, and actually had a dramatic change in the way the profitability of the business. So if I'm looking at surplus and excess inventory, the first thing you want to do is don't buy more of it. It's really common to have too much inventory and then have a fixed min-max or something of that sort set and just keep replenishing it. You sell a little bit of it and you buy more. So just know that we don't need to buy more of it, and the system should manage that process for you with those dynamic controls we just talked about. But then, maybe I move surplus from one warehouse to a place where I have a need. And I never am a proponent necessarily of saying, let's move all our surplus to where we think we'll need it. I like to move it when we do need it. When we see a need where we would buy from a vendor in another warehouse, then I'd like to move the right amount of inventory, the amount that I'm going to buy from that vendor, from my surplus to that warehouse. And that way you don't end up shipping the same product 4 or 5 times to multiple warehouses. And then, of course, return to vendor. I should be able to look at something that says, these are the products that I really want to get rid of. And in some industries, you have pretty liberal return policies. Certainly the automotive industries do that. But there are other industries as well that have pretty liberal return policies to vendor. And so you can take advantage of that, of course, to reduce inventory. So here's something that we spend a lot of time on. This is calculated every day in the system, so surplus and excess inventory. So what we should be able to tell if we're looking at all these dynamic controls and the forecast and time phase expected inventory, we should be able to say, here's what we need in inventory to get us through lead time, review cycle, and safety stock. And we'll keep saying that until that makes sense here, hopefully. But basically what we're trying to do is to say this is the amount of inventory that's good inventory. And then we have more inventory than is really good. That would be classified as either surplus or excess. So we have a number of days that we define as past surplus, or past the inventory that we need as good inventory is actually surplus inventory. And then we have another calculation actually at the product group level that basically says above the surplus I still have inventory, and that is excess. Okay. Now if you're in an electronics business or something of that sort, and you have over 6 months stock of any item, it probably is not going to be worth much by the time that you're able to sell it. And the reason is there will be a new version or a new product come out, those kind of things. So you can tune that based on the types of products and things of that sort. So basically what we're trying to do here is get what we call the good, bad, and the ugly. It's like a Clint Eastwood movie, right? The good inventory is what you need. The bad inventory is inventory that you have a little bit more than you need, but you're probably going to sell it. You're just carrying too much. And then that excess inventory is inventory that you are unlikely to sell. Now, one of the things that happens here, if you're looking at lines of credit and things of that sort, the bank will set some kind of a threshold and say you'll have to show me history over X period of time, and that history has to represent that I'm going to sell. I'll be able to sell my inventory that I have on hand in a given period of time. Let's say 12 months. So if you have over 12 months stock of any item, then you really don't get credit for having that as inventory, right? So the whole scenario here is to try and manage the right amount of inventory, the right place, and keep that inventory down, and get the system to tell you, I have issues. I need to get rid of some products. I need to get other products. I need to redeploy products. So in some of the subsequent videos, we're going to go into how we suggest that all those kinds of things happen. So thank you for watching the session.